There we go. Well, Dan, I think that we're going to go ahead and get started. I just got clicked over here to Zoom. Well, everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Young Red Angus Live. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm really excited about this platform of being able to do uh, shows on YouTube Live and share them with you. The goal and the focus going forward in 2023 is to have a show where I invite guests who are people that have impacted my life or people that inspire me or people that I learn from, that we can um, get on the show, and so people can learn about either the processes that they've learned from, and or the businesses that they have, so that people can find sources to be able to utilize, compost extract or whatever it is. So I'm with that. I'm really excited about tonight's guest. Tonight's guest is Dan Rasure. Dan, am I saying your last name right?
You are.
Perfect. First time I nailed it. Dan and I met about a year ago through a phone call. I was looking to talk to someone just based about the whole process of starting your own business and vermicomposting, and he had a company that he started, Fed and Happy. And so I was picking his brain on that, and also just asking him questions about red wiggler composting worms versus earthworms, and if I could get by. And I was just picking his brain. And so I've kept up with Dan this past year, and our friendship has really grown. And I'm really excited because Dan has agreed to be a show sponsor for the Young Red Angus show. And so his first video that he's sponsoring is coming up here in the month of January. So I'm going to open up and just have you share, Dan, who you are and what your company, Fed and Happy, is all about. So go ahead and share with us, Dan.
Thanks, Jay. So, Fed and Happy, literally, our name says it all. And we start with the microbe and end in you. And with the worms, one day it was a tough day, and it just dawned on me that if the worms are fed and happy that day, then everything else will fall into place. And given the exponential growth of worms and biology, it doesn't mean that we can do the same thing every day, but there are days where all we get done is just making sure the worms are fed and happy. And that really applies to us in life as well. And so there isn't anything that we do perfect. We just try to go and create the best foundation that we can and let nature take care of itself as well. And so that means adding tons of diversity in everything that we're doing, from to feedstock to our worms. We keep very consistent at just a red wiggler, but our feedstocks, we're looking for a lot of diversity, and we're looking to feed our biology differently. We have a 300,000 square foot facility in Hutchinson, Kansas, all indoors, some outside feedstock space, but all of our worms are indoors there. And then we've also built worm farms around the country, as well as in Canada. And in the last 12 months, we've shipped worms, planes, trains, automobiles, boats. And the amount of doors that worms open up is pretty fantastic. So
That's
uh,
awesome. So, Dan, what are the products that you guys are selling right now from Fed and Happy? Like, what is it that they can go to the website and purchase?
we focus on worm castings, worms, biochar, extracts, starter kits, which are great for starting a Johnson Sioux, as well as teas. Our teas we focus on in a fairly localized basis, and then our consulting can start out very small, or it can be very large, where we may do a 5,000 ton worm farm right at your farm.
Okay.
So,
So, um, what year did you get started with Fed and Happy? Like, when did you realize that you wanted to start a worm farm, like, or a composting operation?
So the business came second, but it started with in 2018 or 19. My son had told me that he wanted to be a farmer, and it was
Yeah.
one of the things that resonated with me. And but I also thought about, well, what does he need to learn, um, and what does he need to be as good as he can possibly be at in order to be successful? And I knew he wasn't going to have the same opportunities that I had growing up, and I wasn't having a great week. I was working on a project that had me mostly in Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, and I said, well, he needs to learn about soil, and he needs to learn everything that he can about soil. And then I thought, well, how did I learn about soil? I said, well, I learned about soil via worms. Um, where I grew up, my great grandfather had built the house, and he was a fisherman, and so our properties were just loaded with worms. And so my play area was loaded with worms. My mom is a horticulturist and taught me about composting. And honestly, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, I hated everything about composting and lasagna composting. It was all lots of hard work.
Yeah.
Um, so on the plane, I bought some worms from what felt like an Alta Vista website. And we made every original or every bad mistake. We didn't have biology in the bin. Before we started, we probably had too many green products. But the big thing was not enough biology. And whether it be a small bin or a large bin, the most common mistake is people um, misconceive the fact that worms don't eat the food we give them. They eat the food, they eat what is eating the food. And so a lot of those original worms died. Um, and, but it was something that the worms just didn't really leave my mind. And about 6 months later, I sat down, wrote a plan, and started building a large commercial worm farm. And from there, started a rapid breeding program, learned from as many people as I could about the breeding, and very quickly learned that husbandry of worms really matters, and their feedstocks that they're being fed really matters. And um, so the whole natural ingredients started because of performance. It wasn't anything ideological. It was strictly performance, and noticing that worms that came from a more natural environment reproduced much faster. They got bigger, and overall the bins were healthier. Moisture control was better, and but the biggest thing, our reproduction was as much as 10 times more in the first 3 to 4 months than what we would from a getting worms from somebody that used a lot of corn meals and less natural environment or less natural food. And another thing, we started utilizing brewer's grain. And even though the beer industry is not one that is necessarily certified organic, in my opinion, they've been regen well before regen even really had a name. Um, and and with that, started using a lot of brewer's grain, a lot of pumpkin, and then from there, would take our breeding bins, and I would put them in the building and hutch and start loading up those rows, and until we just had millions of worms. Um, and then, but the whole goal was always to be about castings, to be about the row crop farmer, and to be so economical that every row crop farmer could justify utilizing us. But what happened originally, higher value crops kind of dominated the purchase of worm castings industry wide. And then we got an opportunity to sell some worms, and we sold our first 100 pounds. And honestly, it was kind of miserable. It was a lot of work. And then UPS put a bag around them on an air shipment and killed almost all the worms in that first shipment.
Oh God.
And so going back to the whole flywheel effect and exponential growth, losing 100 pounds early on really hurts. And um, so catching up from that, and like, yep, this is why I focused on the castings. And then about 6 months after that, put out a price for worms, and what we thought was our retail price just started selling wholesale. And from there, over about a 2-year period, kind of started becoming a worm farmer for other worm farms. And so we sell, very rarely do we sell just a pound of worms. Most of our orders are 10 to 1,000 pounds of worms, and most of them are going to other worm farms that then may sell them a pound off a pound at a time, or we're helping build another worm farm somewhere else. And but our big thing with that is still transferring the biology that we work on, and then transferring that to new farms. So that's the worm aspect. The casting part, we try to keep always about 5,000 tons of castings in production. We harvest in a sliver type format, so we're never, just like with the Johnson Sioux, and your biology significantly grows from that year to 18-month mark. The same thing happens in our system, and our system is designed as just a giant Johnson Sioux aspect. So with that, we're harvesting as a sliver, and that way the system is constantly healing itself. So a normal windrow system, when you harvest it, it's like cutting off your arm. In our side, we're just cutting a sliver, so it's like putting a gash in your arm instead of cutting the whole thing off. And so all that biology, especially the fungi that you worked really hard to establish, you're not completely destroying. So then we also take that same product and make it into an extract, and then also a tea. And we do an extract tea hybrid, but most of that stays within 200 to 300 miles on the tea basis. And teas are tricky. Put crap in, get crap out. Also, the need to keep them aerated, fed at the right level. And so if we are going to use teas, it is a more controlled environment. And a lot of it is foliar through fertigating with pivots. And then we're seeing more and more go out on grassland. Grassland sees a pretty remarkable 1-week bounce with the bricks. It's not uncommon to see a bricks level double, anywhere from going from that 8 mark to 16 to 24. And when you get in that 16 range, those grasses become much more resilient to, say, army cutworms, other insects. But the other aspect is you just start getting a lot more growth. And so going back to the intensive grazing, you can get more growth, less time, and causing a better rebound in that grass as well. The other side with that, we do a charged biochar product where we take biochar, we mix some of our castings in with it, as well as some of our liquid products, and charge that to create a very solid carbon food bank. One thing that we've seen with biochar is that when it's naked, it's like putting sawdust out in your fields. It's absorbing all the nutrients out there, and it takes about a year to 18 months to start giving back. When we pre-charge that, it starts giving back to the soil immediately. And I'd say all of our programs are all about delivering more and more carbon to the soil. And then our last product, since Colorado legalized human composting in September of 2021, we designed the biology package for that human composting, and did it originally as a way to be more humane. I started watching livestock composting in 2004. And when I saw some of the original models of what they were proposing, they said, well, we're going to do it like livestock composting. I'm like, well, livestock composting is all about keeping the EPA, your state KDHE equivalent, off your back. It's not about a true humane process. And so worked on a process, worked on a biology package that's very similar to what we use in our facility, and really thought in the first year we'd start seeing things that we could then give to a medical researcher to look at from a different angle. And we've had some surprising things. We haven't found any smoking guns and don't necessarily think that we will, but it is something that is pretty interesting. And but watching the families and how the families interact with it, and always saying, our goal is to take life and give life back. And that's been pretty interesting to see the families respond to that living soil coming back to them.
That's awesome. That has spurred so many questions for me with that answer. But let's start with you said that your system is like a giant Johnson Sioux system. So did you learn your system from Dr. Johnson and ramped up to a larger scale, or were you studying a different composting system and then you found out about his and was like, wow, this is eerily similar to what he's doing?
It was just a constant learning system. I like to have almost every process vermicomposting running, some as insurance, some as learning, and some of them, our breeding system started out with we use a 28 quart Sterilite container. They're $4 to $5, and we poke holes in the lids, and we put about a pound of worms in them, and then we breed them out. We started with that was our main breeding system for growing worms. Now we use that system as both insurance if we need worms or starting rows, but that is our main system of how we build worm farms for other farms. And notice within that system that once we started adding some of the wood components to that even though our reproduction rate slowed down a little bit, we got a much better biological system. So even on our very small boxes that have basically a cubic feet worth of material, it's turned into something pretty similar to a Johnson Sioux, even on that one. And then my big question on Johnson Sioux, and it was, and I think still is, kind of advertised as just a silver bullet and a fix-all and just this wonderful biological system. And when I was really researching it, I was always asking, so why does it work so well? And everybody talked about how to make one and the differences of how they were making one, but I didn't really feel like anybody was talking about why it works so well beyond the air. Then even looking at some of the other supersized systems, kind of looked like it was a lot.
Let me interrupt you on that, Dan. Why does the Johnson Sioux work so well as far as the air component of it? Why is it superior to other composting methods?
I think it's because the wood chunk and the chunky materials help keep that air flowing through. The other side, with that 4 to 6 foot tall container, along with the tubes that get put in and then taken out, it just really helps ensure that airflow is there. I feel that with composting, if you have air and moisture and 60 to 80 degree temperatures, you're going to compost a lot very efficiently. And so for me, my big takeaway on the Johnson Sioux was we need to design systems that continually allow us to breathe. So when we build our system, we place material on the bottom of our row, and then throughout the entire row. And just as a way, basically, we want that to be a living lung. We want it to be breathing from the bottom as well as the top. The other side too, from a worm perspective, is most people talk about how worms like to stay on that first 2 to 6 inches. But if worms have food and they have oxygen and moisture, they will work a very large profile, even red wigglers. So on our system, we only turn our system right in the beginning. We hot compost all of our manure from a regulatory perspective, but we want to do that for that 3 to 7 days, and then we want that to cool down. And with anything, we're not perfect. There's times where we definitely stack up manure and it stays hotter for a longer period of time. But we also know that from a physics perspective that we can't create or destroy energy. So if we're creating heat, we're losing energy, we're losing food for the system. And we just spend a lot of money hauling in that manure, hauling in that carbon. The last thing we want to do is create CO2 or off gas any of those nutrients. Um, so with that, I mean, we use a lot of wood chips. We use the biochar as well. And
You use biochar in your composting bins?
we do. Um, we use them at times in the bottom for a lung. We also will mix them throughout. And it also, I mean, it really depends on what type of biochar. Not all biochar is created equal. The chunkiness, where we think the end product is going to go. But everything, we want to design everything that we can on that bottom aspect to make sure that we're breathing. If we can breathe in from the bottom, then we know we're going to have a very robust system.
Awesome. So what was the progression for you? How did you progress from making the how did you progress from, okay, we're simply making the compost to sell, and then when did you progress into start teaching other people how to make their own worm farms, and what does that look like now? Let's just start with that, and then I'll follow up with the question of what it looks like now as you're training people. But let's just open up with, when did you start training people how to do this, and doing teaching sessions?
So the progression has been somewhat accidental. Like even my original choice of not selling worms was from the aspect that there was a worm seller I wanted to buy worms from, and she said, "Fantastic, I'll sell you worms, but you have to come sort them with me." And it was, my mind was running the entire time. I'm like, this lady is not making any money selling us worms. This is very labor intensive. She just sorting the worms, let alone the growing of the worms and everything else. And so, everybody runs these numbers about castings and how profitable it can be, and it can be, but you also have to sell them. And it's a volatile industry from a timing perspective, that most castings go out in the spring, some in the fall, and we don't have a lot of steady Eddie type customers in this industry, especially with the fall of marijuana. The teaching aspect literally started from a risk avoidance aspect, and the fact that we had a customer via one of our worm farmer friends say, "Would you be able to ship worms to Puerto Rico?" Said yes, but we're going to hand deliver them to make sure that they actually get there. And so that started the teaching of others right there. It was literally just a risk avoidance and making sure that our worms got there alive. And then happened again on a Colorado project, that on a Colorado customer via an Australian consultant and a New Zealand broker literally got back to, and the brokers worked with us in the past and said, "I'm in a bind." They somehow got to my website via an old link, and I don't have any way of fulfilling this order. Can you help me out? And I said, yes. And I said, we'll just hand deliver it. It's close enough to us. And so that was the next progression. And so it's always started from a risk avoidance and making sure that we have a happy customer. And then from there, it's just grown into more and more projects.
So what does the typical project look like? So if I hired you to come do a session where you taught people how to make compost or how to start their own business, what would it look like? And do you do that? Like, do you try to show them how to market this on a large scale?
We do. So we ask our first thing is always, what are your goals? And is it to reduce your inputs on your farm? Is it to take care of a manure problem that you have from a stable? Is it so you can run an education center? And so from there, then we go and start building out the plan of what that needs to look like. And in almost all circumstances, nobody is fully prepared to provide all the feedstocks that they need to have a very good, diverse vermicomposting system. They may have a horse manure and they may have a dairy manure, but they're going to lack that diversity typically. And so working with them, and that no worm farm is the same. We all have different feedstocks. I mean, one may have sugar gas, one may have tons of horse manure, one may have tons of wood chips, and so it's about making a blend that works for you both locally and with the worms. And also, we find that one of the harder things to teach is that, when you get started, everybody, including myself, we want to work with that local grocery store. But what we find is that the local grocery store only provides us 10 to 300 gallons worth of food a week, or the coffee shop or the brewery. And that oftentimes just getting a pickup load of material costs us more or significantly more than getting a semi-load worth of material. And oftentimes that semi-load, it's a phone call and it's delivered, and usually our net price, even without our own labor, ends up being significantly cheaper. The other side is working with what equipment you have available. This can be done on a relatively low equipment standpoint, but you're going to increase your human labor. And then the other aspect too is, if you're using a lot of the worm castings on your farm, then you don't need an expensive screening system. You just need more and more feedstocks to have a good, stable system. And you're far better off spending your money hauling more manure to create a bigger system than you are investing $25,000 to $75,000 into a screener system so you get everything to be perfect. So again, there's definitely not a one size fits all. And with that, we incorporate cover crops because we almost all have winters. And if we don't have winters, we have water problems. We have seasons where we have too much rain, or we live in places like Western Kansas where we don't get a lot of rain. And the one thing about whether it be a Johnson Sioux or a worm system, they are not water light. They are consuming water. So everything that we can do to reduce that water input is a significant gain. And we found that our best avenue for doing so and creating better fertilizer is using cover crops.
Yeah. So what do you mean by using cover crops? Like using them how?
So we use them both from the root structure to have that living root, but the other aspect is really covering that soil and not letting that system be naked. I'm not a fan of using plastic covers at all. I believe that plastic covers create a false read. Worms liked condensation, and so when you put a plastic cover on, they're naturally drawn to that plastic cover, and they work that top surface, but they're not working the rest of it as much. They tend to be smaller. Their reproduction is a little bit less. When we plant a cover crop on top, they work a bigger profile. That as long as we have a root structure, they're working that entire profile of where that root structure is at. So it gives us one more avenue. One thing that definitely happens with all these systems is that as time goes on, we lose oxygen within the system as things are breaking down by having a good root structure, we're constantly delivering more oxygen into that system as well.
Okay, and so that's where I was a little lost. You're literally planting a cover crop on the top of your composting system for the cover on the top of your compost.
That's correct.
That's awesome. So like does it depend on the season as to what you plant?
So it depends on the season. It depends on the manure that we're starting with. Um, I mean, and it also just depends on where we're at. In our indoor system in Hutchinson, we plant a cover crop about every 6 weeks because since we're indoors, we don't get a lot of growth. In other markets, we may plant one cover crop and let it go an entire season. And we may start off with something that is very nitrogen hungry because it's fresher manure. And as that system matures, we adjust that mix and continue to adjust that mix. And literally, it started as an accident. Um, when we had breeding bins that used to feed a ton of pumpkins and seeds and all, and when we had a bin that we just didn't like, would just throw it out in the manure pile, and had some beautiful, incredibly vascular pumpkin plants. But you really noticed that, underneath those plants was really robust. Um, then then had one of our consulting customers that they loved to flood their worm farm. It was rarely too dry, but they had a lot of times where they flooded their worm farm. And so the idea came, well, if we plant a cover crop on there, that will give them one more read of how that farm is doing. And they're going to be less likely to flood that farm. But the aspect of that is that once we planted that cover crop, our worm production significantly went up because those worms start circulating around the root balls, the radishes, the turnips, and laying cocoons right along that root ball. Um, the roots actually feed those cocoons because they're osmotic. So they're more likely to hatch right at the perfect time, have multiples as far as worm babies. The plants do better, and just found that, it's a much more symbiotic system. And so then it just kept growing from there. And in a year like this year, in an extreme drought, we had some farms that getting a cover crop established, even with good water, stunk. That, I mean, 116 days will do that. Um, but we had other farms where that cover crop got established, and up until this last cold snap, that cover crop was still doing really well. And they're some of our best systems. We see better fungi growth, better balance, and better diversity. And it also, from a teaching perspective, I'm very big about incorporating family. That when we incorporate the whole family, kids into the systems, um, everybody gets more excited about it. But the systems also teach about insects and beneficial insects. And oftentimes these worm farms will look like a massive ladybug farm on them. Sometimes you'll see aphids and sometimes you won't, but you see the pest insects like an aphid and a ladybug actually working in a symbiotic relationship. Sometimes it'll get a little bit out of whack and you'll actually see the aphids. Other times it's almost a perfect balance and you really don't see the aphids, that they're eating a weak part of the plant, and then immediately getting attacked by a ladybug. The amount of praying mantises, um, but I think these large farms, they're a learning tool for the farmer as well, and for the kids out there asking questions, and just like learning how to farm with our toy tractors and tillage. I think it's important at Christmas time to give tanks to kids, um, and that way they know that no, I'm not going out to put in hydrous on the field. I'm going out to put worm extract or worm tea out on the field, and I think it creates a pretty cool um, understanding.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So Dan, what was what was your history in farming like before all of this? Like you brought up that your kid didn't have the same kind of option. So what was it that caused the catalyst that started starting Fed and Happy?
Um, so growing up, my grandparents both farmed, but my dad had lumberyards, and so I spent most of my time at the lumberyard, but still had a lot of farm exposure. And when I was trying to decide which way I wanted to go, I I was thinking about it from a regenerative aspect even then. And in the
What year
90s,
was that you were thinking the regenerative aspect?
um, this was in the 90s,
Okay.
um, and my grandfather um, raised a lot of blue corn and red corn in the 90s, organic before there was a certificate. And he was doing it from a profitability perspective. He wasn't doing it because of a regen aspect. He was doing it because of a profitability aspect and always looking for a different angle. Um, and then on my mom's side, um, my uncle's been a regen for as long as I can remember. So whether it be the regen Facebook group, even before I was involved with worms, I was reading those articles within the regen group. Um, and then I also had several million bushels worth of grain storage for ADM at one point in the around 2010. Um, and so was constantly pulled towards ag, but hadn't made that final leap. And after I wrapped up a project in California, I was looking at the regen and the microbe companies, Indigo and others, and but there was something that really struck with me on. I believe a lot of the microbe companies are trying to pick a winner and a loser, and a lot of them are very single focused on just one or just a small handful of microbes. And I mean, I'll use Indigo. I mean, that point, I mean, $1.2 billion worth of invested capital. It takes a lot of profitability to create a return for those investors. And said, if we just follow what nature has already established, we don't need $1 billion worth of invested capital. And we can have a smorgasbord. We can have the kitchen sink of biology, because in reality, plants are going to have a different level of stress almost every day of the season. And so the more we can feed that system and get that system used to that diversity, then once we take that fertilizer and put it out in the field, it's already used to working in a symbiotic way, and then transferring that and growing it in the field. And so, I mean, that was the big aha moment for me in September-ish of 2019. I'd say that, we can have just a big kitchen sink. Let's throw the kitchen sink at it and create that smorgasbord, and also understand that we're not going to be very smart about this to begin with, and that we just need to have good, healthy soil. And if we start with good, healthy soil, then as our technology improves, we can increase our diversity. We can increase how we manage that diversity. One thing that's frustrated me is that I don't feel that we've been able to always feed for what we want, which we vary our feedstocks. We create a lot of, I wouldn't say variability, but we add to our feedstock significantly. But there's still, hops are an example. When we get fresh hops from a brewery, they create just a crazy explosion within our worms, and yet the hops, nothing happens to the hops. And in all reality, when we put hops on top of a pile, it actually should hurt us. They've been sitting in alcohol. Hops can have some slightly um, antibacterial tendencies to them. And yet, when we put them on top of a pile, we'll see an explosion. I mean, this year we saw areas that they were an inch thick of worms, just solid, in the entire area that we put hops. Now, the problem with that is we can't really test that on an ongoing basis because the only time we get fresh hops are once or twice a year in a pretty tight time span from a brewery. And so we miss an opportunity, we miss it for a year. And so, and the other kind of, we had two aha moments related to soluble fibers. We still don't know why it works, but the more soluble fiber we put into our system, we see benefits within our biology, just like what we do within our gut. And then also, we continue to see that all the way through to the plant side. Um, the other, um, we've seen some interesting things related to soy meals um, and negative effects on biology that we can't seem to overcome. Now, the ironic aspect is when we use corn stovers that have been treated with some of the same chemicals that soy gets treated with, um, we don't see the negative biological aspects. And so I think our big thing is that it's always a constant learning. Um, and, spent grains coming from a brewery on a brand new system in days 1 through 5, the biology eats the berry. Days 5 through 8, it eats the hull and any chaff that's in there. But after a month, that system knows that it's going to get new berries, and so it only eats the berry, and then you start seeing a buildup of the hulls and chaff. And so that's part of the reason why we are constantly breeding biology. We have 750,000 gallons worth of rainwater collection tanks that we collect all of our rainwater, use it to water the worms, but then that rainwater goes into a blending, about a 75,000 gallon blending pit where we add alfalfa, we add fish water, other biology, and then from there, we're constantly feeding that to the worms. So our worms never get just true water. It's always a biologically active water.
So, Dan, how much did you know about composting prior to 2018?
I knew the basics. Um, I knew the basics from my mom from when I was very young. Um, but, and I think it's why we also have a very KISS type system. Um, but I'd say I knew virtually nothing in reality. And we're constantly, I'm learning more and more every day. I mean, it's not um, I think, it's often talked about that we know less than 1% about what's going on in the soil. And so that I constantly drive back to that's why we have to just continue to add more organic matter in a balance that will allow the biology to thrive.
That's what it really inspires me and encourages me. Like I feel like all the stuff that I've learned since 2020, with Johnson Sue, like I love it and I feel like I've grown a lot. But I mean, what you've been able to do in 4 years, really three, because you took that first year to start learning about it, and then you really kind of launched your company in 2019, right? Like Fed and
Right.
Happy. So like how many different facilities do you guys have right now?
I think we're in 8 to 9 different locations, and how those are managed is different at each location. Um,
Oh,
and
nuts.
um, we do some crazy things. We ship the majority of our worms via airplane, and it is literally a risk avoidance deal. It's not the smartest business thing at times, but with today's shipping environment, when you're shipping thousands of dollars worth of worms, it's a really big hit when UPS decides to delay a shipment by a day or 2 days, and all of a sudden your shipment that is totally uninsurable is now toast. Um, and so that um, we fall, good to great, great by choice, and we shoot a lot of bullets, aim, and then line up for the cannonball. But also knowing that this biological system, whether it's in our system, in a facility, or your field, it is a flywheel, and that the best time to start was yesterday, and that we've got a lot of pushing to do in order to build the resilience, and that momentum just starts taking care of itself. But it does happen. And in a year like this year, where it's hot, it's dry, it's cold, it can be pretty frustrating because we're having to push twice as hard uphill sometimes. But once we get some of that resiliency built, a year like this becomes manageable. And I kind of feel that regen ag, it's very similar to the difference between flying a jet and flying a 172, and that conventional ag, in my opinion, is much like flying a jet, and that everything can be coming at you very fast. Insect windows, fungus windows, heat, whatnot. Flying the 172 is more like regen ag, where when you have healthy soil, you have more time to react. You have more decisions. You have more options. But it's also slower. Um, and you need to be planning about that 6 months ahead, the season before. And, I kind of get excited towards the end of a season, and thinking about what applications we're going to be doing on crops, because I also know that, we may get a little bit of boost on the current crop, but we're thinking about the next crop already. And the other side too is making sure that we have enough residue and getting that food into the soil. And again, whether it's our system or the field, always thinking about feeding it more. If we leave more than what we take, we're going to be in a great position. That these systems can turn into evergreen systems, whether it be the biology, the worms, the soil health, but we have to be feeding it, overfeeding it in a way that it can handle.
That's awesome. So Dan, I feel like anybody could do what you're doing, but not everybody does it for a specific, fear, or there's a limiting factor that holds them back. What makes you different than the average person? Like, what's made you successful when the average person would not have been able to accomplish what you've been able to accomplish?
Um, I think some of it is persistence, um, and but also it's my belief in nature. It goes up every day, and knowing that nature's been doing a lot of awesome things for a long time. If we just continue to support that and don't um, don't stop the flywheel, don't stop feeding it, then it will take care of us. Um, the other and some of that, I um, footsteps in the sand, was was always next to our kitchen window growing up. So it's kind of constantly something that's in my head, and I feel that good soil health is very similar.
The
And
footsteps in the sand, do you mean that like thing that they usually put on the at funerals about walking with the Lord?
yep.
Awesome. So
um,
like let's speak to specifically that. Why did that speak to you so much?
um, just knowing that we're never alone, um, and that he's always with us. But you know that same thing related to the soil is that when we're not alone with the soil, um, that it's constantly working, the biology is constantly working. And as long as we don't do something to stop the biology, if we don't kill the biology, then it will find ways to help us. Um, even if we don't understand how it's going to help us. Um, but I think, I think when we can slow down the use of fungicides or stop the use of fungicides, um, it it has a tremendous aspect on what we're doing from the compost aspect, and then same thing on the pesticide side. But also, you've got to learn to look at things a little bit differently in the field, and that you are going to see some non-beneficials. But is the system strong enough to handle or to kill those non-beneficials here and there? Um, and the flip side of that too is that when you've got a very strong plant, army cutworms just aren't going to show up. And the weevils, etc. And we like nitrogen as a whole, and so aphids. I don't necessarily think you're going to get rid of aphids. The other aspect is that we have a lot of aphids around us. That even if we have a very healthy field, um, the likelihood that aphids are in the next field over is probably fairly high. So learning to look at that, okay, are the ladybugs going to keep us under control? Are they not? And so from an agronomy aspect, this is, I think regen agronomists are some of the hardest working agronomists out there, because they are really looking at the fields on a much more in-depth level than typical conventional agriculture.
So real quick, it's funny that you brought that up about the aphids, because right before we started on my monitor here, it popped up John Kemp, and he was talking to someone about how insects will not attack a healthy plant. I'm excited to listen to that, but why don't you speak to that? Like, why is it that not beneficial, parasitic funguses and insects are more likely to attack a plant that is unhealthy as opposed to a plant that is healthy? And if you understand that, explain that
Yep.
in this place.
So one, it's just the natural weaknesses of the plant is that there's vulnerabilities. But the other aspect is the fact that you typically have a very healthy biological aspect around that soil. Then the next one is the bricks. Bricks, healthy plants typically have a bricks of 12 to 20s. And with that, most of these parasitic insects are essentially diabetics. And so trying to eat plants that are high in sugar is going to kill them. So.
Okay. So we got a question online. What equipment is available for large scale Johnson Sioux? So I guess he's basically asking you, what equipment do you use in your operation to be able to do this large scale?
So we use a skid loader, and then we use a compost turner, but we only use the compost turner as a blender. So when we build our rows, and our rows are designed as kind of a hybrid walking row is the vermicomposting term. And so we build our rows and then we push them together, and basically have 60-foot by 900-foot rows in our main facility. But we call it a worm pasture. And so we use a basic composter turner, and they cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, but we keep it as basic as possible. Now, on an on-farm system, if we don't have a compost turner, which honestly we rarely do, then we just create a blending system where as feedstocks are coming in, we do a bucket here, and then we move it a few times to create a poor man's blend. It doesn't have to be perfect in order to create a very solid system.
Awesome. Well, Dan, that's about all the time that we have for today, but I want to give you the last bit. Is there anything that we did not cover that you want to share or talk to the viewers about?
Whether it's small scale, large scale, this is about learning every day, failing forward, and No failure is permanent. Make sure you stack up lots of oxygen bottles to keep going, keep above the death line, and just keep learning. Um, and you're going to do well.
Awesome. Well, guys, if you want to know more about Dan's company, it is Fed and Happy. I'll add that to the show notes at the end of this episode. And you guys can, I'm assuming there's a contact us on Fed and Happy's website, correct, Dan?
There is.
Yeah, so if you guys have questions for Dan, or if you guys would like to hire Dan to come out and teach you how to create this system, like he said, he has a program that they have where Dan goes out and he teaches you how to build a composting system that's going to work for you and for what your goals are as an individual or as a business or as a farm. So Dan, thank you so much for making this an amazing Young Red Angus Live. I enjoyed having you, and hopefully we'll have another show later on next year, and you can come back and give us an update on how things are going.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jay.
Awesome. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. That does it for us, and we'll catch you next week on another episode of Young Red Angus Live. I'll catch you guys later.